Alan Stratton from As Wood Turns. On a previous segment, I turned a piece of green apricot into a bowl and left it rough, coated it with wax, and now it's drying. We're trying to be patient as it dries in the shop. However, a viewer asked that I try to microwave dry the wood. So I'm going to use this. I'm going to start small and use a piece of the same apricot tree but smaller limb piece. And let's turn this and microwave it and see how it does. But just to illustrate what can happen, from the last bowl, this was a piece that I cut off of it. I actually cut off the bark also and then coated it with wax just as I did the other bowl. But this one, instead of putting it into a paper bag, I left it out in the shop. And if you can look closely, you see that there's this huge crack in the sapwood and along the sapwood here. And although this was coated with wax, it was left out in the out to dry, and it has checked significantly. So let's start small and see how we do with this piece.
For this piece, I'm just going to use my screw chuck and a tailstock. I don't see that it's big enough and awkward enough to use the major guard on the machine. So just chuck it up between the two, use my gouge and tool off the bottom. I want to rough it out and leave it fairly thick because I am going to dry this in the microwave and see how that goes for us. So tool it out. One thing about the microwaving in this case, I went through 27 cycles or so where I put it on 20% of the microwave, had it in a plastic bag, although it was an open plastic bag, to let it cycle. 20% of power, 2 minutes, let it cool down. At first I kind of rushed it and did it quite a few, and then later on I spread out the intervals to about 5 or plus minutes before I nuked it again. It felt warm. But I was a little bit afraid when I finished the drying process, because I did have quite a few checks showing. On one side of the bowl there was a bit of the pith that had separated. There was other checks primarily in the end grain. I was a little bit afraid that I was going to have a ruined bowl in the end. So when I remounted it, I went ahead and used some CA glue, the cyanoacrylic glue, and kind of took and coated the trouble spots around the pith and the other checks to just make sure that it flowed in and filled those spots before I got turning again. Now the rim did crack a little bit more than what I wanted to, so the bowl's not quite as high as I had envisioned it being up front, because I had to tool that edge off. But I'm not sure whether I can blame that on the drying process or just, things that happen. So as it turns out, I cannot see any of those checks except a little bit around the pith, which is almost to be expected. It almost looks like a knot process there. So it turned out fine. We'll have to see. I've put it since into after finishing it with walnut oil. I've coated it good and put it into again a paper bag, and to just let it mellow just a little bit more. Make sure it gets to room humidity and room temperature in a very gradual, slow process, and hopefully it will not check any further. We'll see on that. On this video, I did, when I sanded it, I did go through all the appropriate grits, going from 100 up to 400. It was not as many tight corners on this one, so I was able to use a power sander, and that makes that otherwise dull, boring process go quite nice. I for one am not one that enjoys sanding. I did finish it with walnut oil. Used the jaw chuck to do most of the turning after I turned the tenon on the bottom, and then once the bowl side was done, or the concave side was done, I went ahead and flipped it over and used a vacuum chuck. It has a vacuum on it. Due to the size of the bowl, I was not very comfortable with it having had a great seal and it being really rock solid on that, so I tried to be extremely careful to not put any, great pressure as I tooled it. So the tooling at this point was all very, very light. I brought up the tailstock and to put a little pressure on it and make sure that it stayed put while we're turning it, and then that resulted in a slight button on the bottom. I took that off with a sharp chisel and got it down good, and then in the sanding phase polished it off. Once you flip it over, it's very difficult to get it aligned, but I wanted to tool it up, take very, very light strokes as it got to the previously finished edge on that, and just let it go. But it turned out very beautifully, and I could not detect any of the checks that I saw when it had just been dried. So I termed this a success. We'll have to try it with a bigger piece.